third speaker, George Baker. I'm just going to find, sorry, George Barker.
Okay.
Sorry. I'm doing too many things at once, clearly, just here.
Lovely. Thank you. Where you finished, Dora, is quite interesting because I am talking a little bit more about the overall philosophy of a museum. And also of interest, we have at the Cooper Hewitt, I'm sorry I don't work there, but they have exactly the same recognition technology where you stand in front and you do body recognition. Where I differ slightly, my evaluation hasn't been done with working with a museum. I'm actually entirely removed from the Cooper Hewitt. I have been, but I am instead, I work in film and media art conservation and research. So I'm really looking at it from a theoretical perspective. I have a lovely paper. I'm sorry, I'm going to read from this. That's how I kind of present. So I met Seb Chan, who was the head of digital and emerging media at the Cooper Hewitt in Amsterdam, where I study audiovisual archiving. And he did a presentation, and I kind of disseminated a little bit of what I think the Cooper Hewitt is doing. So in 2011, the Cooper Hewitt Smithsonian Design Museum closed its doors for a 3-year, $91 million renovation project. Huge renovation project. I think it could be posited that the project was twofold in its aims. So firstly, industry specialists were brought in to restore and preserve the architecture of the Carnegie Mansion, which is this beautiful, beautiful house here. It's a Georgian 64-room home located in Manhattan's Museum Mile next to the Guggenheim. And the Design Museum was initially established in 1897 by the Cooper Hewitt sisters, and it opened to great success. But by the turn of the 21st century, both its interiors and its visitor counts were slowly deteriorating, which prompted this gargantuan architectural and digital renovation project that was undertaken. So when I became interested in it, I started to look at journalism, what was being written about the Cooper Hewitt renovation in papers. And I think multiple and at times paradoxical terms were used to describe the Cooper Hewitt upon its reopening in 2014. So there was Carolyn Bauman, who was the museum's director, states that the project was a process of renewing or restoring, and at the same time a rethink of the museum's practices. Sebastian Chan, who I met, called it a reboot of the museum experience for a new, constantly connected audience. And the Sydney Morning Herald went so far to state its ubiquitous integration of digital technologies presents an overhaul of the museum experience as we know it itself. So what I want to do a little bit here is highlight the tension between the terms renovation and restoration, both used to describe the new Cooper Hewitt experience, where monolithic black 4K touchscreen tables are placed alongside traditional artifacts that span 30 centuries of design in a restored Georgian house. On this architectural and technological clash, Robertson Meyer writes that sometimes you climb these stone steps carpeted with maroon velvet and find yourself in a hall of pristine white wall splashed with huge sans serifs. And he went on to state that this new museum experience is steampunk, which I love as an interesting sort of theoretical term. And I think if the restoration of the building itself can be conceived or considered as steampunk, in that it embraces a certain dissonance between old and new design, then the Cooper Hewitt's sort of internal architecture with the white wall and the Georgian style is only reflective of a steampunk curatorial and access mode that is similarly at play here, where old and new design technologies and old and new museological philosophies collide. So perhaps unavoidable in a project that can be described as a digital overhaul is the question of how the integration of digital technologies or digital technological apparatuses into the Cooper Hewitt affect a visitor's material relationship with the original artifacts of the collection. However, as Andrew Whitcomb writes, and I put up here, I think there's a need to begin from a different starting point, one that does not presume such a radical and politicized opposition between the material and the virtual. As a different starting point, I want to consider the museum's history as a vital approach to which to question the extent to which a digital renovation can be considered an overhaul or some sort of epistemic rupture in both the curation of and visitors' access to the Cooper Hewitt's collection. So the collection itself is a wide spectrum of designs, including illustrations, ceramics, wallpapers, ornaments, and furniture. Now, in the renovation, the museum was really gutted so that 60% more exhibition space was created and the museum could showcase more of its original artifacts. Yet, at the same time, the museum's given up loads of this enlarged exhibition space in order to install 6 large dining table-sized touchscreens, where visitors can access not only exhibits they've just witnessed in the collection, but also the digital surrogates of the remainder of the physical collection, of which there's about 210,000 objects that have been photographed. In order to view these digital artifacts, visitors grab a small icon from what they call an object river, which floats centrally down through the touchscreen table, and they bring it to their respective workstation. Once they've fished for an object, it can subsequently be enlarged and its infographics and historical information accessed. A really complex API and metadata system was developed by the museum, which links the photographed object fished to extraneous relevant digital artifacts that can also be accessed, which kind of makes these touchscreen tables a really dense and comprehensively interlinked database through which to view an entirely digital and complete form of the museum's collection. So in many ways, not only in terms of increased access, the centralized tablet is transformational in the experience of the Cooper Hewitt collection. So whereas the original artifact in the museum holds with it weight, aura, evidence, and the passage of time, which I think was something you were touching upon as well, multimedia artifacts are often really supposed as being immediate and surface and slippery, temporary, popular and democratic, as again, I take from Whitcomb. As the digitized artifact becomes malleable on the table, it loses some of its historicity and perhaps its material significance for the visitor. Wanda Slauven writes on touchscreen technology that when we do reach out and grab the objects on the table, we don't touch the image but the material surface of the screen, so that we are more concerned with manipulating data and transferring information than engaging with the artifact itself. Now, her apprehensions concerning the haptic and epistemic loss occurring in user interaction with surrogate digital collections can be reiterated by the Immersion room in the Cooper Hewitt. So this is the Immersion room, and what used to be there was swatch books, which contained wallpaper, let me just find, I've lost it, wallpaper samples to palm through. So this is what used to be on display in this room, and now it's been replaced by a table where visitors can design new digital wallpapers which are simultaneously projected onto the walls of what used to be Margaret Carnegie's bedroom. So feeling the original wallpaper has been replaced with swiping, and the bumps, dots, and patina of the material artifacts are now replaced with digitized, flattened, projected versions. This was heralded by the New Yorker as the real futuristic moment of the new Cooper Hewitt, and it was recently recreated in the London Design Biennial in 2016, where they brought the whole room over. And the technology of the Immersion room is kind of concomitant with the relegation of these historical wallpapers, which now we just don't see in the museum. It brings with it this certain tension between the digital and the physical, and the old and the new, but also between play and pedagogy in how we experience museums. But rather than diverting further attention towards the everlasting dichotomy or parable of the immateriality of cyberspace and the immateriality of multimedia objects in museums, I think it's significant to also question how this digital resource lost it. Okay, wait, I'll start again. I think digital technologies can sort of easily be placed in conjunction with conservative concerns towards touch and play in the museums, which, as you said, are often considered to encourage improper attention or modes of play. But when I sort of wanted to look at it, I looked at the history of the Cooper-Hewitt. And integral to the philosophy of the Cooper-Hewitt sisters at the turn of the 20th century was a degree of whimsicality, as is reported by Politicized in this book. The sisters in 1897 liked games and illusions and toys the more ingeniously designed to surprise and titillate the eye the better, and so they included peep shows, magic lanterns, puppets, kaleidoscopes, and zoetropes amongst the static objects that still make up the majority of this design collection. So then I started to think, well, the kaleidoscopic patterns of the objects floating down this digital river, actually, yes, they do mediate the experience of the Cooper-Hewitt collection, but perhaps in a way that correlates to a museum which has always welcomed technological contraptions of this kind. As opposed to focusing on the haptic loss of the authentic artifact, instead we might take the trajectory of Fiona Cameron, who states that digital historical objects can potentially be seen as objects in their own right. They can play to notions of polysemy, the experiential, and the sensual. In this case, I think the experiential quality of the digital surrogates presented on the tables in the Cooper-Hewitt, which offer a mode of play and manipulation by touch, may actually correspond to curatorial philosophies which were instilled over 100 years ago at the turn of the 20th century. Now, whilst the integration of these kind of touch technology tables is commonplace practice in museums around the globe, albeit in different forms and on different scales, the most radical break in the visitor experience and level of access provided to the collection is provided by this introduction of the design and archive pen in the Cooper-Hewitt. Now, essentially, the Cooper-Hewitt pen has two functions. It designs and archives. And how this is enacted is by you go up, so you see your original object here, and there's a little sphere, and you touch the pen on that sphere, and it beeps, and then you've collected the objects. You then take it to the 4K touchscreen table, you put it down here, and the object comes up in a sort of 3D model that then you can manipulate and touch and design over. It's given at admission, and it enables every visitor to collect objects from around the galleries and create their own designs on these interactive tables, and over 94% of visitors to the museum use the pen when they go and visit. They've made it a really ubiquitous part of the experience. I think particularly significant or interesting for me is the requirement of the pen upon the visitor to physically oscillate between the artifacts where they collect the data before going to the table where they can find the digital surrogate for infographic exploration. So in doing so, the pen reaffirms again this steampunk mode of pedagogy and access where new and old media interact and shape one another's meaning. Instead, I also follow the theory of Henry Jenkins, who writes that old and new media will interact in ever more complex ways, talking about this media convergence paradigm, which I put a quote up here. I think it's a concept that's quite relevant to the way in which visitors oscillate between the media in the Cooper-Hewitt. When I met Seb Chan last year as well, I was talking to him about this convergent paradigm, and then I went back to an interview, and he stated, well, yes, that was an inclination of what happened at the Cooper-Hewitt. He wanted to get a sense of these objects not existing as separate from one another, but the digital and the original artifact having sort of multiple interpretations and multiple lives, and the technology allows these multiple lives to be revealed. So the potential of the pen also to archive a visit to the Cooper-Hewitt and extend the experience beyond the parameters of the mansion also addresses what may have caused the question of how to bind the vast possibilities of the digital with the finite fact of the physical, which allows for multiple viewings and multiple lives of an artifact. So every visitor to the Cooper-Hewitt is given a code when they exit. This code then corresponds, they go back to their computer, they enter their code, and everything that they've scanned comes up on their screen. So they create their own sub-collection online. therefore, I think the pen really amalgamates three lives of an object. There's the physical artifact, the digital table surrogate, and the online photographic representation of their own curated collection. So if there was an overhaul of the museum experience presented here, I think it is in the pen. It's in the facilitation of the digital preservation of an autonomously built online collection, and that's the newest experience that we have on offer. The pen is a memory device, and it places an ability to sort of shift curatorial responsibilities into the hands of the visitor. And then you can reconceive the museum not as a storehouse of treasures, but sort of as this archive of the commons. But on the other hand, when these new technologies emerges, there's always some sort of fallback, and you have to really look at the efficacy of this model. Is it actually working? Are people actually going online and visiting? And there is some drawbacks. Actually, only 25% of visitors in the Cooper Hewitt go online after. So they might archive and have fun during their experience collecting it, but they then only go back. Then a third of this 25, so less than 10%, are actually creating an account that assures kind of the online preservation of their collection. So most people will go and visit it again, but then they won't keep in checking and going back to the museum and adding and building to this online archive for themselves. So it's not quite yet a participatory archive online. I follow the methodology or the theory of Hewitt. She states that the usability of a participatory archive, the usability does not denote use alone, but also denotes a deeper level of involvement in the sense of actual participation in the archive and the archival process. And I don't think there's a sense of actual participation in the archival process being sort of implemented in the visitors of the Cooper Hewitt. Instead, the pen really is just functioning to create this oscillation, as I mentioned before, between the digital artifact on the table and the physical artifact in the museum. So then I was thinking about the pen as a new technology within a museum space anyway. And if the majority of Cooper Hewitt visitors use the pen in this capacity to collect information from a physical artifact and then play with it on a touchscreen technology table, I don't think this is really a new phenomenon either when you go back to the history of the museum. So the Hewitt sisters initially imagined their mansion as a museum for use and for study, and they actually actively encouraged patrons to bring with them a pen and some paper so they might replicate the designs held in their collections, replications which they could then take home with them. Oh, and this one. Okay. Here's some lovely photographs from the 1920s in the Cooper Hewitt. Accessibility was always at the forefront of the Cooper Hewitt's philosophy, so much so that it was the first museum in New York to open during the nighttime for study. And many New Yorkers were impressed that there was no red tape and no restrictions with which the collections may be seen. So few were the restrictions imposed that the artifacts were allowed to be moved from their positions according to the light that best suited the visitor studying and drawing the piece. As such, the expansion of the museum online is some way an extension of an earlier open door access policy, and the integration of the pen as a device to move objects and create is perhaps not as a radical or as a new curatorial design feature as it may initially seem. In a way, access and use has always been encouraged in the Cooper Hewitt, and so the rethinking of the museum through the integration of digital technologies could perhaps, after all, be considered as a restoration. The restoration I'm talking about here would be of the pre-existing curatorial philosophies geared towards access and use of the exhibitions for study by doing and learning design by designing. I will finish. So in a symposium focused on evaluating digital cultural resources, I thought it might be significant to draw your attention to the Cooper Hewitt as a museum that may authenticate new digital strategies by appropriating them with founding curatorial philosophies. In order to move away from these kind of phenomenological or pedagogical apprehensions that technological structures can often instill, Connections found between old and new media strategies can attribute heritage value to ventures that are often described in futurological terms. Whilst my interest in the museum does not come from a practitioner's perspective, and I haven't worked directly with them, it's more so found in historical and media research. Those who are interested in the resources built by the Cooper Hewitt should explore their very, very comprehensive online blog. They detail all the work that they do. They have an open data policy. You can track everything that's done with the pen. So I didn't really think it was necessary for me to represent work that's not my own. Actually, they really put it all out there online. For further study, I think the efficacy of the pen as a mode of tracking visitor tendencies in the museum would be a really valuable line of research from both an insider and an outsider perspective. But for now, I shall definitely conclude and extend my thanks for inviting me here today. Thank you.
Okay, so now some questions. I hope you have questions. Our speakers will come and join us up at the table. Let's try and turn this off. No. So for me, from a museum's background, that's given me lots of food for thought about what we have been doing and what we should be doing and what we could but maybe shouldn't do. What questions do people have? I'm looking for a hand. Yes, lovely. Here.
I think this is one for George. I'm not quite sure whether I just missed a little bit where the very impressive digital interacting opportunities are actually happening in the same rooms that also exhibit the originals. And my question would be, if they don't, which they don't have to, then when these digital new things, or sometimes just the presence of a cafe, means that your footfall increases, while people don't actually see the originals, my question is, I don't actually know what my question is. This is almost the question. Is that a problem, or is it not a problem? I don't come from a museum background. My background is library, but in a way, you know, do we count who comes through the door, or do we count what people take home? And maybe that isn't actually interaction with an original, and is that a problem or not?
I don't think it's a question that I can answer, but it's a question that I'm interested in as well. I mean, really, it's a complete overhaul of the museum in terms of even the way they present themselves through typeface. And yeah, it's massively successful, and now it's a completely different kind of museum, and it was a failing museum before. Do we care about the way that the museum is structured in terms of people's experiences? I think that yes, you should look at how, if any attention is being drawn to the original artefacts, because I'm sorry, I work in film conservation, so this really materiality is something that I often have to argue for. Yes, they're placed in the same room. This is the only room, actually, in the museum that only has a digital artifact, and all the material objects have been taken out. But if you look at any new photographs or any representations of Cooper Hewitt, the architecture of the room is so that this really large table is in the middle, and the crowd centre around the table, away from the originals. So it's also interesting to just sort of look at the press materials that are released from it and photographs of visitors' experiences, because you can really get the idea that people are there to play with the table as a new design feature, and then all these wonderful original artefacts that are housed in the collection become sort of supplementary.
Thank you. Does anybody else have a question? Will, yeah, back. Oh.
So I had a kind of slightly heretical thought that I'll spill just now, but actually it leads to a more sensible question, okay? So my slightly heretical thought is that museums don't get many opportunities for big renovation projects. It only comes along like once in 100 years or something in your case. So it's a big deal to get a museum renovation project, and that means we take the big opportunity, and it costs 90 million, $100 million, whatever. And I've been involved in those projects, and I get it. And the heretical thought is, if we didn't think about it so much, if museum renovation projects weren't such a paradigmatic rupture in our fabric of our universe, would that mean that we would have a few more of them? If we went at it less hard, would we actually have more renovation projects? And that's the heretical thought. That's not really the question. The question I want to move on to is, actually, what does that mean for our evaluation of digital resources and digital cultural heritage? And I suppose what I'm maybe heading to is a question as to whether the methodologies that we adapt and use in the context of museums, where the opportunity to renew and renovate is really infrequent, are necessarily easily applicable to a context of digital resources where we know, if anything, about speed and flexibility and responsiveness. So I suppose I'm asking all of the speakers whether you feel there's a tension between, on one hand, the great opportunity associated with museum renovation on a once-a-century basis versus how we need to evaluate and respond in the context of digital resources.
Cruel, William.
You're right. This is an amazing project, and when I responded to them when I was first presented with it, and said I was impressed with the amount that they can do, and that yes, it's got a lot of people in. It's fascinating. I'm not critical of it in any way. I just think. Come to my avenue of research, I guess. I always like to question when things have a futurological dimension to it. And so actually I was trying to build, when you are given this much money and you are given these new design capabilities, what's fascinating about the Cooper Hewitt is they did publish a book going back around the history of it, and they did then try and find art historical materials and find art historical relevance for some of the exhibitions. Whether they completely worked in some examples, I'm a little bit more skeptical of something like the Immersion room, just because I think it means that there's a complete relegation of all these wonderful artifacts that are stored. But my perspective is, yes, these renovation projects can be enacted. And if you're evaluating digital cultural resources, how I would evaluate them is a completely different way, but I would evaluate them through, okay, let's find the history of the museum, the history of the exhibition, and how can these new digital resources relate to other exhibitions, because they completely can, and that's a really valid way of defending digital resources, I think.
I mean, the museum I was working with is also renovating and really rebranding themselves, and for me, I think the point I left off with was I was struggling to see sort of, they've worked on so many things, but I was kind of struggling to really see the interpretation aspect being really developed. Because they did focus a lot on these kind of new interactive installations, and I think it would have been useful at an earlier start of the process to really get a lot of feedback from professionals from different types of fields, rather than now, which might be a bit. I didn't really know what the question was, but yeah, there we go.
I think from my perspective, from having been involved in large museum projects as well, large museum projects have a timescale of their own, and the digital can move much faster, and so one is needing to procure what your digital content and your digital interface with your visitors is 2 years in advance of the new museum opening, and that in itself can be, you can look past, say, before you've even opened. And as you say, William, the large investment in these capital projects doesn't always translate into the large revenue to sustain those museums. And so having something fabulous like the Design and Archive pen, not many organisations will be able to maintain that in a sustainable way for the next 10 or 15 years. And there's a real tension there, I feel, from where I work, in how those interactive, interpretive elements within a museum setting can be kept alive and keep up to date with what users want, because Google and our phones we renew them on an 18-month contract. You can't renew your exhibition displays on an 18-month contract, and thereby you've got a real tension of keeping up with what the majority of visitors and users want. So yes, I totally get what you're saying, William. Did anybody? Sorry,
just
somebody.
to add something, probably one of the advantages of the digital is that you don't necessarily need to wait for this huge or new reopening or innovation. Or to better say it, you could, but that would be projects like Helena presented us earlier. Okay, so you have a reopening and then you want to work with your new digital technologies and museum interactives on site. But as it concerns the connection with the online content, my feeling is that some evaluation is much better than no evaluation at all, and this is something that should be done in regular intervals and not only once every, 3 or 4 or 5 years. Yeah.
Thanks, Areti. Does anybody have any more questions? Or is it, yes, we've got 2 here. Okay, just quickly then, 1 here and then.
One question, I think, for all 3 of you, if that's okay. This better? Yeah. Okay. So one question for all 3 presenters. These physical objects that are used in the projects, in all 3 projects, I think today, the pen and the blocks on the table, and the beer mug or the other items in the handling collection. Do the evaluations tell us something about the choices about these projects? I think Laura talked a little bit about how the next iteration will use color, for example, to make it more obvious that the blocks need to be on the table. But do we get data from the evaluations as well about the design or the choices of objects?
Yeah, so that was part of the discussion of the focus group, to ask about materials, because the blocks we were using were prototypes, so they were just plastic, not really the ones that they're going to use. So it was part of the discussion, and I think they did get feedback on preferences in terms of materials. But it's difficult to really test those things, but yeah.
What we found out was that they liked the objects. Now, the truth is that some of them were more realistic as in comparison with others. Okay, so it was really easy to reproduce the tea bag at its original size. We also experimented with true scents, but that didn't work out very well because the tea was going out of the tea bags and it was this huge mess in the museum. Same thing for the armband and the travel pass. We couldn't do this for the beer mug. So we are aware that, it's much better to have an object that has the original weight and probably why not the original texture too. So we're taking small steps. Now with regards to whether they liked this or not, whether they got the idea of the 3 perspectives, what was really interesting is that when we did the phone interviews 6 months after the visit, of course the colors with which they were describing their interaction with the replicas were not that vivid, but nevertheless they referred to them without us prompting them to do it. The instructions were, you won't ask about any replicas, you will just ask them how their day in the museum went. So I guess that is an alternative way of engaging with narratives and with objects. it's worth to be, kind of examined more. There's a lot of power in having to deal with objects rather than screens, right?
Great. Thanks very much. I think that's it. Thank you very much. We are keeping to just about. Thank you very much to our speakers again. I think they deserve